I secretly removed my son from his sister's wedding after his cruel jokes made her cry. Then exaggerated what he said, told the family not to share any details with him, and let him discover from other people that he was no longer welcome. Before we go on, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. I deleted his name from the family group while my daughter cried locked in the bathroom. I did it with the phone in my hand, leaning against the hallway wall, listening to her ragged breathing from the other side of the door. I thought I was avoiding a conflict, but someone decided to show how I did it, and did so in front of everyone. I'm Laura, I'm 52 years old, and I never imagined that days before my youngest daughter's wedding I'd feel like the entire family was a ticking time bomb. Clara has always been sensitive. It's not a word I love, but it's the most honest one. You could tell since she was a little girl. Crowds, noises, sustained attention exhausted her. Over the years, she learned to live with it, to name it, to anticipate it. When she told me she was getting married, the first thing she mentioned wasn't the date or the dress. It was fear. Fear of people, of stares, of comments, of something getting out of control. That's why I agreed to help her from the beginning, not as a meddling mother. At least that's not how I saw it, but as someone who knew how to read her daughter's gestures better than anyone. We decided on something small. Few guests, nothing ostentatious, a quiet place. Clara kept saying she wanted to reach the altar without feeling her chest tighten. I nodded, convinced that if we kept everything under control, it was possible. Martin, her older brother, was never good with that kind of care. He's 31 years old and has a way of speaking that he calls honesty, and the rest of us usually call sarcasm. He's always been like that. Since he was a kid, he'd make out-of-place comments and then hide behind the excuse that he didn't know how to lie. I learned to soften it, to change the subject, to act as a buffer. With the announcement of the engagement, that role became constant. First, it was a few stray jokes, unsolicited opinions about the restaurant. An ironic laugh when Clara showed the dress she had chosen with such excitement. A comment about Julian, the fiancé, asking if he was sure if it wasn't too soon, if he was ready for all that. I tried to stop the impact before it reached her, sometimes with a look, sometimes with a quick comment. I never confronted him head-on. I told myself it wasn't the time, that it wasn't worth starting a bigger fight, until one night everything broke a little. We were having dinner at home. One of those gatherings that are supposed to be simple, but always have something heavy floating in the air. Clara was nervous, you could tell. Martin had arrived in that acidic mood of his. Amid uncomfortable laughter, he made the comment. He said something about how long the marriage would last if it was already starting with so much stress. He said it lightly, like someone tossing out a passing phrase. Nobody laughed. The silence was thick. Clara got up without a word and locked herself in the bathroom. I went after her almost immediately. I knocked gently on the door. When she opened it, she was shaking. She was crying without making a sound, as if she were even ashamed of that. She told me she didn't want that to be the tone of her wedding, that she didn't want to feel watched, judged, exposed, that she didn't want to go through that on the most important day of her life. That's when I felt I had to nip something in the bud. I didn't go back to the table. I took out my phone and opened the family group, the one where everything related to the wedding was discussed, dates, times, details. Martin's name was there, as always. I hesitated for just a second. Then I deleted it without warning, without a prior message. I closed the chat and took a deep breath. I told the rest later that it was for Clara's own good, that I couldn't trust his behavior, that I'd rather avoid a scene. No one argued with me to my face. Some looked down, others nodded in silence. I interpreted that as support, as understanding. I convinced myself I was doing the right thing, and so no one would doubt. I started to reinforce the story. When someone asked, I'd repeat Martin's comments with a sharper edge, remove the context, omit my silences, painting him as more aggressive than he had been. I didn't experience it as a lie, but as a form of protection. If everyone believed excluding him was necessary, no one would question the decision. No one would jeopardize Clara's calm. At that moment, I thought I had everything under control. I didn't know that the family group, the very one I'd removed him from, would become the clearest proof that control is always fragile and that silence, when stretched too thin, ends up making noise. For the following days I acted as if nothing had changed, although deep down I knew I had altered something that wouldn't fix itself. Clara seemed calmer, not completely fine, but at least she wasn't crying every time someone mentioned the wedding. For me, that was a sufficient sign that I'd done the right thing. I clung to that calm as irrefutable proof, even if it was fragile. Martin didn't say anything at first, at least not directly. I avoided thinking about him. I told myself that if I didn't feed the conflict, it would die out on its own. The family group remained active, full of practical messages, photos of the venue, last-minute adjustments. Each notification gave me a strange mix of relief and tension. Relief because Clara wasn't exposed, tension because I knew that bubble had an expiration date. Some relatives started asking stray questions, comments that seemed innocent but showed a certain discomfort. Why wasn't Martin commenting? Why wasn't he in the conversations? I responded with short phrases, always the same ones. That it was better this way. That we needed peace. That Clara couldn't handle any more pressure. I didn't give too many details, but when someone insisted I'd exaggerate again, not because they asked me to, but because I felt I had to justify myself a little more each time. I realized I was rewriting the events even for myself. I started remembering comments that hadn't been so harsh as if they had been. I found myself using words he hadn't said but that fit better with the image I needed to maintain. I didn't stop myself. I thought I was already too deep in to have doubts. Clara didn't ask about her brother, which both reassured and unsettled me. There was something in her silence I couldn't read. When I asked her one afternoon if she was okay with Martin not being involved, she told me she didn't want to think about it, that she preferred to focus on getting to the day without feeling bad. I took that answer as a tacit authorization, though I know now it was more a request for a truce than a real decision. Meanwhile, Martin started appearing in parallel conversations, not with me, but with others. I found out through crossed comments, through looks that lasted a second longer than normal. Someone mentioned he was confused, that he didn't understand what had happened. Another person said he'd found out about his exclusion from third parties. That phrase bothered me more than it should have. I felt they were questioning me without saying it. Instead of talking to him, I reinforced the barrier. I explicitly asked them not to share information with him, not to forward messages, not to involve him. I presented it as a temporary measure, although in my head it was already permanent. Each request was a way to buy time, but also to tighten the rope further. The family atmosphere began to change. Conversations became more careful, as if everyone was measuring every word. No one wanted to be the next to end up on the wrong side of the story. I noticed this discomfort, but I interpreted it as the price to pay for Clara's peace of mind. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that after the wedding everything would settle down. I didn't count on someone starting to connect the dots. It was my sister-in-law who first said something different. She didn't confront me at first. She asked me for details, dates, what exactly Martin had said, and when I answered without much thought, sure of my version. Days later she brought up the topic again, but with a different tone. She mentioned screenshots, messages from me sent at different times where I narrated the episodes with words that didn't quite match each other. At first I got defensive. I said they were nuances, that the intention was the same. She didn't argue. She just listened. That attitude was worse than any reproach. I felt for the first time that the story could slip out of my hands. The doubts didn't stay between us. They seeped out subtly, but constantly. Someone asked out loud if it wouldn't have been better to talk things out. Another commented that maybe Martin hadn't understood the impact of his words. I answered as always, but it didn't sound the same anymore. There were cracks in my confidence, and they were showing. A few days before the wedding, I started to get the feeling that something was going to explode. I didn't know how or when, only that the silence I had built was too dense. Clara was focused on the final details, but I saw her more tense again, not because of Martin, but because of the atmosphere, as if she sensed something was moving beneath the surface. The night before the event, I hardly slept. I mentally reviewed every decision, every message sent, every exaggeration. I told myself there was no turning back, that what was done, that confronting Martin now would only make things worse. I didn't imagine he had already decided not to stay on the sidelines and that the way he was going to reappear wouldn't leave room for versions or carefully constructed silences. The morning of the wedding dawned too quiet, and that stillness made me nervous from the first moment. Everything was in its place. The dress hanging, confirmation messages arriving one after another, Clara taking a deep breath in front of the mirror as if rehearsing a calm she didn't quite believe. I moved around the house with an almost automatic efficiency, busying myself with small things so as not to think about what I was avoiding. There was an idea that had been haunting me for days and that I refused to face. It wasn't guilt, at least not entirely. It was something more uncomfortable. The suspicion that I wasn't only protecting Clara, but also protecting myself from a difficult conversation, from acknowledging that for years I had allowed Martin to be the way he was, always buffering, always justifying, and that now I was paying the price for not having set boundaries sooner. I told myself it wasn't the time to reflect, that there would be time later. That day I had a clear role, and I couldn't deviate. Clara was beautiful, but I didn't say it out loud like other mothers. I was afraid of burdening her with words. I limited myself to accompanying her, asking if she needed anything, observing her every gesture. I noticed how her shoulders tensed when she heard loud laughter outside, how she glanced at the door, as if waiting for something to burst in. I watched her too, and every time I saw her restless, I reinforced my conviction that I had done the right thing. There was a moment while I was adjusting her veil when she asked me if everything was going to be okay. She didn't specify what she was referring to. I told her yes, with a confidence I didn't feel. She nodded, but didn't smile. That was the first time I thought that perhaps I had confused silence with tranquility. The trip to the venue was brief. The space was just as we had imagined, discreet, warm. People started to arrive gradually. They greeted, congratulated, found their seats. I watched everything with exaggerated attention, as if I were looking for a flaw in the system. Every time I saw someone looking at their phone, I felt a pang. I knew the doubts were still circulating, even if no one named them. During the ceremony, I tried to focus on Clara, on her breathing, on the way she squeezed Julian's hand, on how she managed to hold herself together despite everything. But my mind kept returning to the same point. Martin, where was he? What was he thinking? If he knew exactly what had been said about him, if he had seen the screenshots my sister-in-law had mentioned, there was no abrupt entrance or a shout to announce his arrival. It was more subtle and, for that very reason, disturbing. I saw him before anyone fully reacted. He was standing near the entrance, in a suit, serious, looking around as if searching for someone. For me. I felt my stomach clench. Some guests turned around, others took out their phones almost by reflex. The murmur grew, but no one said anything. Martin advanced slowly, without rushing, until he was in front of me. He didn't raise his voice. That was the worst part. He asked me with a calmness I'd never seen in him, why they had deleted him, why no one had spoken to him, why he had found out about his exclusion from third parties. I answered what I had rehearsed in my head for days, that it was for Clara, that I couldn't trust his behavior, that it wasn't the time to discuss it. As I spoke, I felt my own words lose weight in the air. Martin listened to everything without interrupting, then he mentioned the screenshots. He said he had my messages, dates, different versions of the same episode. He didn't show them, but he didn't have to. The silence that formed was immediate, dense, heavy. I felt eyes on me, not with anger, but with an uncomfortable mixture of surprise and disappointment. I wanted to explain, to justify, to say that I had exaggerated for Clara's sake, that it hadn't been with bad intentions, but the phrases stumbled in my mouth. Martin didn't argue anymore. He said he just wanted to understand at what point he had stopped being part of the family. Then he turned and went to sit on the side. The ceremony continued because no one knew how to stop it. Clara walked to the altar, got married, smiled in the photos, went through each step as if following a learned script. Later she confessed to me that she spent part of the event expecting something to explode, that she couldn't fully relax even after the I do. Martin left before the party, without saying goodbye. Some noticed, others pretended not to. I stayed until the end, smiling when appropriate, accepting congratulations, maintaining an image that was already cracked. That night, when everything was over, I sat alone in the kitchen. I checked my phone. The family group was still there, silent for the first time since I had created it. I realized I had used silence as a tool, convinced it was care, when in reality it was also a form of power. I didn't know yet what would be left standing after that. I was only sure that nothing would go back to normal on its own, and that the calm I had tried to manufacture had come at a cost I was just beginning to understand. The days after the wedding didn't have the shape of a clear aftermath. There was no closure or healing conversation, nor that sense of relief I had imagined as the final goal. What there was a strange emptiness, like when a house is too quiet after a party and you don't know whether to clean up or leave everything as it is so you don't have to face the mess. The first sign that something had truly broken was the absence of messages. The family group, the same one I had used as a control center, was frozen. No one wrote, no one shared photos, no one asked how Clara was. At first I thought it was fatigue, then I understood it was something else. No one wanted to say something that could open a wound that was already visible. Clara came back from her honeymoon quieter, not obviously sad, but different. She no longer talked about the wedding as something that had ended, but as something she had survived. She told me she was grateful that she had managed to get married without a crisis, but she also confessed that for weeks her body had been on constant alert, as if she had gone through the event waiting for the final blow that never quite came. She didn't blame me, and that's what unsettled me the most. Martin, on the other hand, disappeared. He stopped coming to gatherings, stopped answering some messages. Whenever someone mentioned him, the atmosphere immediately tensed. I tried to write to him a couple of times, short, careful messages, without getting into the heart of the matter. I got no response. I couldn't blame him. After all, I had decided not to talk when there was still a chance. As the weeks went by, the consequences became more visible. Birthdays celebrated in separate groups, lunches where someone was always missing, whispered comments. My sister-in-law, who had shown the screenshots, stopped coming as often, not out of explicit anger, but out of exhaustion. I realized that my need to maintain aversion had dragged everyone into a constant discomfort. There was one particular gathering that finally showed me the extent of the damage. It was a simple lunch, intended to resume some normality. There were fewer of us than usual. At one point, someone asked if Martin was coming. No one answered. The silence was long, awkward, almost violent. Clara looked down. I felt a pressure in my chest that I couldn't hide. It was then I understood that I had created a crack that wouldn't close on its own, that protecting one child hadn't meant taking care of the whole family, that by avoiding a direct confrontation, I had chosen a bigger and more public one. The scene at the wedding hadn't been the end, but the point from which everything began to unravel. I tried to convince myself that time would fix things, that Martin would come back, that the gatherings would resume, but every daily gesture proved me wrong. The damage wasn't loud, but it was constant. It was in what wasn't said, in the empty seats, in the conversations that were cut short. One night, looking through old messages, I found one of mine sent weeks before the wedding. It was one of those exaggerated explanations I had sent to justify the exclusion. I read it with distance for the first time. It sounded foreign, harsher than I remembered. I didn't recognize the mother I thought I was, but someone who had chosen control over dialogue. I didn't know what to do with that realization. Apologizing guaranteed nothing. Explaining myself even less. It was no longer in my hands to decide when or how it would be repaired. For the first time in a long time, I had to accept that I couldn't intervene without making things worse. The family continued to function, but in a different, fragmented way, as if each of us had learned to move around avoiding certain topics, certain people. I continued to be the mother, the hostess, the organizer, but some of that tacit authority had eroded. What some saw was no longer care, but a dangerous way of deciding for others. And although no one said it to my face, I began to feel that the punishment wasn't an argument or a sudden break, but something slower, more uncomfortable. Having to sit at the table knowing someone was missing, and that their absence wasn't an accident, but a direct consequence of my decisions. As the months passed, I stopped waiting for something to resolve itself. Waiting became an uncomfortable habit, like a misplaced chair that no one moves because we've all learned to walk around it. Family gatherings continued to happen, but never complete. Someone was always missing. And although no one said it out loud, we all knew who. Clara began to build her life away from the noise. I saw her more focused on her marriage, her work, on routines that didn't include us as much as before. It wasn't a reproach, it was a natural shift. I understood that by protecting her from a specific conflict, I had also shown her that the world was better ordered when someone else decided for her. That idea made me more uncomfortable than I expected. Martin didn't come back, not completely. He once showed up briefly for birthday, arrived late, and left early. We greeted each other politely, like acquaintances sharing an awkward past. There was no pending talk or explicit reproach, just a polite distance that weighed more than any argument. I understood that there isn't always a final scene where everything is said. Sometimes the closure is just that. I kept thinking about the family group, about that minimal, almost invisible gesture of deleting a name. I was surprised by how easily I did it, the conviction with which I defended it, the way I turned silence into a strategy. For a long time I told myself it was for love, and in part it was, but it was also fear. Fear of losing control, of something overflowing and me being pointed out as responsible. Today I don't have a clear answer, only an uncomfortable certainty. I avoided an immediate conflict and created a deeper one. I protected a daughter, but I exposed a crack I didn't know how to close. The wedding happened, the photos exist, the marriage continues, but the family, as I knew it, stopped sitting together around the table. And sometimes I wonder if it would have been different with a timely conversation, or if I simply chose the path that was easiest for me to maintain. Story 2. I let my husband treat my daughter like his own for years, then demanded he pay for her future after he said she was never his daughter. Before we go on, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. You are not my daughter. That's what he told her, with that voice of his, so calm, so damn logical. And in that instant I felt something inside me break. Not just my daughter's heart, but mine too. Also everything I thought we'd built as a family. I don't know if this is a confession, a venting, or a plea disguised as a story. I just know I've had this phrase in my head for weeks, like I can't get it out of there. And I need to write it down, I need to let it go, because if I don't, I feel like I'll end up believing it was all my fault. My daughter is 19 years old and today, instead of starting her first semester at college, she's working a double shift at a coffee shop to help me pay rent for a room with damp walls and a single window that won't open. All because the man who raised my daughter since she was 7, the man she called dad for half her childhood, decided from one moment to the next that she was never his responsibility. But let's start from the beginning, or at least from the moment I thought everything was going well. When I met my now ex-husband, my daughter was little. Her biological father was never part of her life. No calls, no visits, not a single measly present on her birthdays. So when this man showed up, polite, successful, with a daughter 3 years older than mine and a stability I'd never known, he seemed like a miracle to me. Did he fall in love with me? Or so he said, and he seemed to genuinely grow fond of my daughter. He bought her books, helped her with her homework, took her to the park. She adored him, called him dad without anyone asking her to, and he didn't correct her. He loved it. Or so I thought. His daughter, on the other hand, was more reserved. Good girl, smart, but distant. We never really connected, but there were no conflicts. We seemed like a functional blended family, the kind that appear in health insurance commercials. We all moved into his house when my daughter was 9. He had a good job, a good house, good manners. I contributed what little I earned as an administrative assistant and took charge of keeping everything in order. For a while, everything seemed fair, balanced, but then the details started. They weren't huge or obvious, just that, details. At Christmas, his daughter got the latest tech while my daughter got clothes. When both broke a rule, only my daughter was punished. He defended his daughter with speeches about adolescence and peer pressure. He scolded mine for not being more mature. I noticed it, of course I did, but I justified it. I thought, she's his blood daughter. It's normal. As long as he's not cruel, as long as he doesn't reject her. How naive. For years I convinced myself that love was enough, that if I was understanding, patient, and my daughter didn't complain, then everything was fine. Even when we signed the mortgage together, and he didn't include my daughter as a direct beneficiary, even when he told me there was no need to formalize adoptions because we were a real family, not one on paper, I wanted to believe him, and for a while I did. My daughter graduated high school with honors. She had an almost perfect GPA. She worked part-time, helped around the house, and still found room to smile. Sometimes I think that was her way of making up for what I couldn't give her. A home with no tension, with no half-differences, with no questions I never dared to ask my husband. In May of that year, on a random afternoon, she came home more excited than usual. She showed me a PowerPoint presentation she'd made with her friends. They wanted to take a 2-week graduation trip through Europe, France, Italy, Spain. They had an itinerary, hostels, compared prices, cheap flights, all well calculated. She presented it to me as if she were selling me an investment. She was thrilled, hopeful, and nervous. "Mom, do you think you could talk to him?" "To Dad," she said, swallowing the lump in her throat. "The others are getting help from their parents. I'm not asking for everything, just what you guys can." And that's when I felt that old twinge in my chest, the one that told me I couldn't promise her anything. That night, after dinner, I brought up the subject. I told him my daughter wanted to go on a trip with her friends, that they'd planned everything, and she just needed help covering her share. He wasn't surprised. He told me he'd already heard it mentioned in passing. He adjusted his glasses, poured himself a glass of wine, and asked me, "How much would it cost?" "About 30,000, I said bluntly. He frowned. Not from a lack of money, I knew he had it, but because he was crunching numbers. He looked at me with that look of his, cold, but reasonable. "I could help, but I'm not going to pay for everything. If she wants to go, she has to put up at least half. And I want to be clear, if we do this, I won't pay for college later. She has to choose either trip or college." I froze. Not because of what he said, but how he said it. As if it were a transaction, a business deal. As if he were negotiating with an employee, not a girl he had raised. "Are you serious?" I asked him. "Are you going to make her choose between a trip and her future?" "I'm talking about priorities," he replied. "You yourself said there isn't enough for everything. I can't pay for 2 people's college. I'm already covering my daughter's studies. If yours wants something, let her earn it. Let her choose." At that moment, my daughter walked in. I don't know if she'd heard anything, or if she'd just arrived by chance. She stared at us. "What's wrong?" I hesitated, but he didn't. "We're talking about your trip. If you decide to go, you'll have to pitch in half. I can cover the rest, but that depletes the fund that could have gone towards college. I won't be able to help you later." She looked at both of us, took a deep breath, and with that maturity that still breaks my soul to remember, she replied, "Okay, I understand. I'll figure it out later." And she left. I wanted to say something. I wanted to stop her, but I didn't. Why? Because I was afraid of breaking the balance, because I thought maybe we could figure it out later, that maybe he would reconsider, that with effort, with help, we could rebuild the fund later on. But that didn't happen. My daughter worked double shifts. We sold some jewelry my mother had given me. I borrowed money. My best friend gave me part of her vacation bonus without hesitation, and in the end we got it. She traveled. She sent me photos from the Colosseum, from the Louvre, from a flowery alley in Lisbon. She looked happy, fulfilled, proud. And I, from my side of the screen, smiled with tears in my eyes, because seeing her like that made me forget for a moment the decision we didn't dare to question. I thought we'd figure it out, but what I didn't know was that that choice, that trip was more expensive than we imagined. The trip ended in late July. My daughter came back with a suitcase full of souvenirs, fridge magnets, unsent postcards, and the biggest smile I'd seen on her in years. She talked to me for hours about the places, the food, the fleeting friendships she made. She had a sparkle in her eyes that, for a second, made me think it had all been worth it. For a second, because exactly a week later the college enrollment process started, and that's when the magic ended. My daughter wanted to study psychology. She'd been clear about her major since she was 14. She'd already visited 2 campuses, met with counselors. She had the form ready. She just needed to pay the initial tuition. One afternoon, she came up to me while we were drinking coffee. She asked me in a low voice, "Do you think you can talk to him? So, he makes the transfer this week." I nodded. Not a single word came out. The same lump that didn't let me speak before was squeezing my throat now. That night I approached him in the kitchen. I reminded him that we'd already talked about the college fund. I told him it was time to keep his promise. "What fund?" he replied without looking up from his cell phone. I looked at him. I thought it was a joke. "The one you said you had for both of them, for your daughter and mine." He let out a long sigh, as if he were tired of repeating something I didn't want to accept. "That fund doesn't exist anymore. She used it for her trip. She knew that." And right at that moment my daughter walked into the kitchen. "What did you say?" He didn't flinch. "That there's no fund. You already used it. You chose to travel. I can't help you with college." She stood there, frozen. "But you said you'd only pay half and that it wouldn't interfere with my studies." And it was like that. I put in my share. Your mother covered the rest, but that was the available money. I didn't think you'd spend so much. I didn't go shopping in Dubai. I slept in hostels. I ate bread and cheese for days. He shrugged. "Still, it was your decision." My daughter looked at me looking for something, an explanation, a defense, a solution. But I didn't say anything because I had nothing to say. "You paid for all of your daughter's college," she said with a broken voice. "Why do you make me choose?" He crossed his arms and then dropped it. "Because you aren't my daughter." He didn't yell. He wasn't cruel. He was practical, like someone clearing up a clerical error. My daughter covered her mouth. She didn't cry. She just stood there holding it all in, shaking. I turned to him with blazing eyes. "And then what was all this? Raising her for 7 years doesn't count. Calling you dad meant nothing." It meant what it had to mean. But I'm not her father. Not legally, not financially, I don't have that obligation. The conversation ended there, or whatever that was. My daughter locked herself in her room. I slept on the couch, though I didn't sleep a wink, and all night I kept repeating the same phrase to myself, "Because you aren't my daughter." I don't know if it was a justification or a confession. All I know is that from that day on, everything we built started to crumble. After that night, silence settled in the house like a third presence. Cold, silent, relentless. My daughter didn't speak to him again. She'd go down to the kitchen when he wasn't there. She ate in her room. She avoided him with the precision of someone who no longer wants to breathe the same air as her silent aggressor. And I became a shadow. I slipped around the house carefully, as if stepping too hard could make everything blow up, but I couldn't sit idly by. If he wasn't going to pay for college, I had to find another way. I remembered a joint account we'd opened 3 years ago when we talked about sharing everything. It wasn't his main account, but he used to deposit money there for household stuff, big purchases, unforeseen events, school expenses. I'd used it several times before with his approval, so I went to the bank. Asked for a check for 20,000 pesos. Tuition and the first expenses for materials, transportation, and months of college food for my daughter. I signed it with trembling hands. I prayed to goodwill, to old agreements, to years of living together, but the check bounced. The manager pulled me aside. He told me with a kind but firm voice that the account had been closed 2 months ago, that it was no longer active, that my signature was invalid. I felt naked in that bank. Not because of the money, but because of the revelation. He'd already decided. It wasn't a reaction. It was premeditated. That same day, I went home and waited for him in the dining room. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. When he walked in, I showed him the bounce check and the paper they gave me at the bank. "Did you know?" He looked at me without surprise. "Yes." "Did you do it on purpose?" "Yes." Silence. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I already knew you were going to try to use that money. And I didn't want any more arguments." My eyes burned. "You didn't give me a choice." He walked over to the sideboard, opened a drawer, took out a manila envelope, put it on the table between us, pushed it toward me without another word. I opened it. Divorce papers signed by him. What is this? What I should have done a long time ago. Are you serious?
Yes.
I've had the draft saved since last year. I was just waiting for the right moment. I laughed out of anger, out of disbelief. And you thought this was a good time. I thought you saw it coming already after everything we lived through, after raising my daughter with you, after everything. Exactly because of that, because we aren't a team anymore, because you and your daughter were always separate. Because you expected me to act like a father, but only when it suited you. The words fell like blades. I gave you everything I had. I told him. Time, energy, years of my life. And you and I paid for everything for years, but I can't keep doing it feeling like it was never enough. And that's your excuse to kick me out. I'm not kicking you out. I just think it's time for each of us to go our separate ways. And my daughter isn't my daughter. There he said it again. Cold, final, like a legal hammer blow. You have until the end of the day, he added. You can take whatever you want, but I need you out before nightfall. He looked at me one last time. Not with hate, with indifference, and left. I didn't cry. Not in front of him. I didn't give him the satisfaction. I went to my daughter's room. I told her to pack a bag, to only take the essentials. She didn't ask. She just nodded and started packing. We left that same afternoon with no scenes, no yelling, no slammed doors, just with what fit in a suitcase. The room we rented had damp-stained walls, a bed with a lopsided mattress, and a single lamp that buzzed as if it were complaining about being there with us. My daughter slept on the floor the first 2 nights, even though I insisted on taking turns. She didn't say anything. She just put on her headphones and disappeared into her songs. We didn't talk much, not because we were fighting, but because any word could make everything shatter. We walked carefully on the silence, as if it were thin ice. I told myself it was because of the stress, the change, the shock, but deep down I knew there was something else. One afternoon, 3 weeks before the start of the semester, I heard her crying in the bathroom. Really crying. Those breathless cries where the body shakes. I just knocked carefully on the door. Are you okay?
No.
I opened it slowly. She was sitting on the floor with the college form in her hands. It was crumpled as if she wanted to tear it up without doing it. They told me I can't apply this semester anymore, she muttered. That the system closed, that I should have made the minimum deposit a week ago. She covered her eyes with her hands, and I can't ask for a loan because I have no credit history and because I don't have legal parents to back me up. I don't qualify. I crouched down next to her. I tried to hug her. She rejected me without violence, but firmly. Why didn't you tell me that if I agreed to that trip I wouldn't be able to study? I swallowed hard. I thought we could figure it out later. It wasn't your decision. I just wanted you to have something nice so you wouldn't miss out on that like I missed out. But this wasn't a whim, Mom. It was my future. The blow of those words pierced me because she was right, because I felt exactly like her in other times, because I repeated a cycle without realizing it. You know what the worst part is? She said with red eyes that I feel like an idiot, that I let myself be fooled. What did I think, that he loved me like a daughter? It wasn't your fault, I told her, but it wasn't just his fault either. She looked at me. You knew too. No, I couldn't lie. Yes. And why didn't you ever say anything? Because I was afraid of losing him, of destabilizing everything. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I did the right thing, if I didn't ask for too much, we'd have something left. And that was better than nothing. But we were left with nothing, Mom. Just this. She got up, walked towards the door. Before leaving, she said something that still haunts me. I don't know if he failed me or if you did too, but what hurts the most is that it doesn't matter anymore. And she closed the door behind her. I stayed there on the bathroom floor with the crumpled form in my hands, as if I could smooth it out and make everything possible again, but it wasn't anymore, because we all failed, and now there's no turning back. It's been 2 months since we left that house, since we stuffed what we could into a suitcase and walked out the door without looking back. Since we left the photos in the frames, the clothes in the drawers, and the plates that still smelled of the last dinner shared in silence. Since we lost something we never knew if it was really ours, Now we live in a rented room with thin walls and windows that don't close all the way. My daughter got a job at a coffee shop. I got one at a stationery store that pays just minimum wage. Sometimes our schedules don't match up and we only cross paths to exchange keys and brief greetings. We don't talk much about the past. We don't talk much about anything. Actually, college already started. She's not enrolled. She says she's in no rush, but I know she's broken inside. Sometimes I hear her reviewing old notes or watching classes on YouTube as if she could still be part of the system they didn't let her enter. I've tried contacting my ex at first just to talk, to ask him, beg him, explain that we made mistakes, yes, but that my daughter didn't deserve to pay for them. He never answered a call, a message, nothing. I asked a lawyer to look into whether there was a way to claim anything, alimony, compensation, whatever. He told me legally there is no basis. He didn't adopt my daughter. There's no record of formal promises, there's nothing, just memories, photos, moments, and none of those hold weight in a courtroom. Sometimes I find myself wondering if he ever loved us, if he faked it the whole time, or if he just got tired of faking it. Maybe he saw us as a temporary project, as a phase, as a paper family. Maybe I failed too. By not demanding, by not speaking up, by not protecting her when it was necessary, even if that meant fighting. My daughter hugs me sometimes, those quick hugs, without words, but that say, I'm still here, and I hug her back because that's all we have left. And I'm still here. Today, while silently folding clothes, I found an old photo. It was from years ago. The four of us, my daughter, his daughter, him, and me, all smiling. I stared at it for minutes, as if I were trying to remember if that happiness was real or just a very well-acted illusion. I put it away in the deepest drawer I have. Not because I want to forget it, but because maybe I never knew what it really was.